parts of this. We'll get started, I think, once a month in the spring, and then we'll do ethics and supervision. And in the fall, we're going to do counseling ethics. And then in the spring, we'll do supervision and ethics. So the learning objectives for today are to review some of the ethical principles related to substance abuse counseling. See how those principles support good practice. I keep getting muted for some reason, so I'm now unmuted. So we will have opportunity later on for some comments and participation, and you can use the chat box on that, or you can just raise your hand or just speak out. So, all right. So we call this the Golden Five. These are kind of the five underlying principles for ethical behavior and practice in counseling and substance abuse counseling. And so everybody, hopefully everybody, I'm sure everybody's familiar with these, but autonomy is the principle that really everybody has the right individual decision, self-determination, and we don't do things that would unnecessarily infringe on someone's autonomy. So we wouldn't put somebody in the hospital unnecessarily. We wouldn't try to censor somebody unnecessarily, and we would try to, in our treatment, we talk about level of care and severity of illness. So we try to make sure that, we're not putting somebody in a higher level of care that doesn't need to be there because of their illness or their problems. And so we would restrict their autonomy and their freedom. So autonomy is one of the things we always try to strive for, is to maintain the maximum amount of autonomy for people. And then beneficence is this idea that you're going to contribute to the well-being of others. And we'll talk about non-maleficence here in a minute, but beneficence is really about doing good to others. It's trying to contribute to people's well-being, and it's helping them out. And so this occurs when there's a significant need on another person's part, and the provider responder, of course, has some qualifications and knowledge. There's a probability of success, and the risk and the benefits are at least equal. Hopefully the benefits outweigh the risk. And so in those kind of situations, benefits is the kind of thing we're looking for. We're looking for people that are going to, in their interaction with others, they're going to promote the well-being of the other person, and they're going to do what's best for other people within the constraints of their professional activity. Non-maleficence is this idea that we do no harm, and that's always been a maximum in medicine, and it's a maximum in mental health care as well. We don't want to do anything that's going to cause intentional harm. So here again, when we extend this a little bit, we're talking about evidence-based practices, and we're talking about, using treatment methods that are going to be the most effective. We're also talking about trying not to waste people's time at treatments that aren't necessary, or treatments that aren't effective. And certainly then we don't want to do anything that's going to, deteriorate somebody's condition. So we're always trying to make sure that we don't do any harm. Our treatments and our interaction with people don't cause any kind of harm or injury. And then justice has to do with, being fair in terms of the way you practice, in terms of the way things do. So do all kinds of people, have access to the same kind of appointment schedule. So, people of different race, people of a different socioeconomic background, they have equal opportunity for visits, whenever you practice. So it's not constricted to some time. That you don't discriminate based on different kinds of problems or race or ethnicity or those kinds of things. So justice means fairness and equalness and equal opportunity for folks to receive treatment. Now, that doesn't mean you can't have some limitations on what you do, either by interest or by scope, but you treat people fairly. And if that's not your thing to treat, if that's beyond your expertise or your scope, then you treat people fairly with the referral, or with names and numbers and contact information, so they can get the treatment that they need. And then fidelity is so important in counseling, and that has to do with trustworthiness. All of these are important, but fidelity or trustworthiness, and people have to feel that they can trust a counselor, they can trust a psychologist, social worker, because they're going to tell them stuff that probably they haven't told other people before, or certainly in a way that they haven't told other people. And then you're going to trust that they're going to trust that provider to give them, truthful answers and do, interact with them in a way that's going to be in their best interest. So this whole idea of fidelity is very important, and it is one of those principles that underlines the whole idea of confidentiality and those kind of things. So your patients need to believe and it be and factual that they can believe in, that you're going to be truthful, you're going to be loyal. So these 5 conditions or these 5 values apply in situations where there's, the patient voluntarily comes for some treatment. And the competence of the professional and the professional relationship is there. So the full disclosure of what's going on. So when we have those kind of items, and we usually have those kind of items in counseling, as people come to you voluntarily, generally speaking, you're competent to provide what you're doing, and you have an identified professional relationship, and there's full disclosure about what's going to go on in terms of that relationship or that treatment. In these 5, the golden 5, certainly apply. If you're having friends, if you're having coffee with a friend, or you just strike up a friendship, then these 5 principles don't necessarily apply. But in a professional relationship, a voluntary professional relationship, then certainly these 5 apply. So we get into the ethics, whether you're looking at LADC ethics, social work ethics, psychology ethics, any kind of counseling ethics. We see these 3 things pop up over and over again. And they're a little bit different, but they're important for us to take a look at in terms of ethical considerations, ethical behavior, and in terms of best practices. So privacy is this idea that it's secret, it's not open, it's not public, it's not on Facebook, it's not posted in the newspaper. That what goes on in a counseling session is private, and society has decided that it's important for people to have a place to go to get professional counseling or get professional help where it's going to be private, where it's going to be not exposed. And so that goes for billing, it goes for notes, it goes for records, it goes for all of those kinds of things. Now, we know there's some exceptions to privacy, and we know that from HIPAA, but generally speaking, privacy is one of those fundamental kind of ethical principles we try to uphold as best we can. So that's the idea of privacy. Confidentiality is more like the legal responsibility to provide privacy and to protect privacy. And so privacy is kind of the idea that we try to do. People, need private opportunities to talk about what's going on. But the confidentiality is in the safeguards, the responsibility to put those safeguards in place so that there is privacy. So we don't talk about people. We don't, like I said, post them on Facebook. We don't leave the sign-in sheet out in the foyer so everybody can see it, who comes in and knows who's been in counseling, earlier that day. When somebody wants some information, we make sure that the patient releases that information, gives authorization for us to release that information. And so confidentiality is this idea that it's our responsibility to ensure privacy. Now, anonymity is kind of a different kind of thing. And anonymity has to do that, nobody knows. And so most of us don't ensure anonymity because we're not set up, or we don't practice in a way where somebody comes into the office and nobody else is going to know that they've ever been there, or we don't have parking, or we don't have some arrangement so that nobody can identify their car in our driveway. So sometimes over here at the Ellis Island Center, sometimes for anonymity, because anonymity is needed in some kind of cases, people have aliases, so they don't even have their name connected to the chart and those kind of things. And so that's really what you're getting into when you're talking about anonymity, is like nobody knows. So nobody can identify you as having been there or as being a part of participated in counseling or any of those kind of things. Now, with substance abuse, there's some federal laws that extend, and we're not going to get into that today, but there's some federal laws you have to consider with, and for obviously good kind of reasons when it comes to substance abuse treatment. So here's a case. So this is where you get to talk a little bit to me. So this is a mother of a 21-year-old patient calls concerned about her daughter and wants to share some information. So during the conversation, the mother asked, how is her daughter doing in her recovery? So any thoughts on that? Just if you can unmute yourself, you just let me know. I'll look at the little chat thing here.
With her daughter,
Huh?
if she's not with her daughter, she just wants to know.
Yep, she just calls you. She's not with her daughter. She just calls.
She doesn't have a signed release of information on file.
Nope, just calls to tell you. Just calls, say, hey, my daughter Susie's got something I need to tell you about my daughter Susie. What do you
She
think?
can tell you anything she wants to tell you. You just can't tell her anything if you treat her.
All right, so what are you saying? What factors come into play, you think, Lenore?
Pardon?
Huh? What
Well, there's
factors do you think come into
confidentiality.
play?
Her daughter has to give you permission to share any information with her mother.
Okay.
Another point is that I can't even let you know that she is my client without that information. I think that's the last point that you made about not letting people know that that's your client. That's what I usually tell people. I can't tell you if that's discussing if they are a client of mine, I could not discuss them with you.
Yep, two very good points. So should you speak to the mother at all? If the mother says that, should you make comments? Should you answer her questions? I mean, those are kind of important things to know before you get into that. Answering the call. So Lenore, you say you'd probably take the call, and Rita, you'd say you probably wouldn't take the call?
In my experience, when people usually call and say, I need to talk to you about my daughter that's going to you, I usually tell them that I could not even talk to you. I acknowledge that that person is or is not a client.
Okay, that's a good point. Sean, you got something?
Yeah, normally in those cases when I can't confirm either way, I would just basically just kind of stick, if I'm unsure, I just stick to just general information that I would just share regardless. And then I would just probably have started that out, but I can't confirm or deny if this is a patient or not. So you know what, please, I'm glad to listen, but all my comments would just basically be just in general to either my program or whatever it is, the area that, I might be working in at the time.
Good. Those are all good points. And so some other questions that I had were, should, like some of you are saying, Rita, I mean, should you even acknowledge seeing the patient? I know on inpatient units, certainly we tend to say that. We tend to say, well, I can't acknowledge if the person's here or not. An outpatient may be a little bit different. What do you do if the mother's paying the bills and the girl's still living at home versus, a 21-year-old who's fully emancipated, married, and, living away or living a couple of states away? I mean, would that come into, is something maybe you want to think about?
But if I know that if the mother has come in with the daughter or something like that, I will remind her. I will want to listen. That's just, you want to listen because you want as much information as you can to make some good decisions about your clients.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the person came in and I'm aware and they're aware that I know that that's their mother, I still will remind them, I cannot discuss her with you.
Mm-hmm.
However, I want to listen. If they can talk to me all day long. Well, no, they can't, not really. But they can talk, they can tell me information and I don't have to acknowledge that I know, I will not share the daughter's information.
So that's a good point. Then you always got to think about, which side of the case do you want to be on? If the mother's calling you up to tell you that the girl, has been locking herself in the bathroom and she's threatening suicide, but she hadn't told you that.
Right.
Of course, if she hadn't told you that, you don't know it. But sometimes you'd hate to be on the, on the witness stand somewhere and say, well, I tried 3 times to call, nobody would take my call. I was tell you. So I don't know. I think the main thing, I don't think this is uncommon, but probably one of the things we have to think through is, what basis are we making our decisions on? What ethical principles are we basing, our decisions and our actions on? So being aware of that is important. So let's move on to informed consent. So informed consent is this idea that, patients know what they're getting into. And, kind of the three things you want in informed consent are that the patient has the capacity to understand, that the patient does understand, and the patient's free to make decisions. And so those are kind of the basic ideas about informed consent. But in terms of counseling, sometimes we need to think about things like, is informed consent more than just signing the piece of paper that somebody signs when they come to treatment? Does informed consent mean that that the folks know how long it's going to take to be in counseling? Does informed consent have to do with your background and your expertise and your training? Does informed consent have to do with with how much it's going to cost? Does informed consent have to do with what you're going to ask the patient to do, what kind of treatment they're going to be? So there's a lot of issues of informed consent that we probably need to think a little bit more about when we're visiting with our patients. And so, you get to that question is how much informed consent is, necessary for the patient to have informed consent? I mean, how much information do they need to know? And, kind of the question is, what would prudent professionals do? Or, what type of information would they give? And so sometimes we think more about this. We think about medical procedures and we think about medications and those kind of things. But probably when we're talking to psychotherapy or counseling or those kind of things, it would be a good idea to spend some time on informed consent and make sure that, the patients know, the nuts and bolts about what it is that they're getting into, and what we'll be asking, and the approach that we'll be taking. So, and, you usually can't go wrong with informed consent. I mean, I guess at some point, you could say, you've told the patient too much, but generally speaking, you can't go wrong with informed consent. So here's a case. So a couple attends an initial counseling session. The counselor starts with the initial assessment of the relationship, then individual evaluations, and finally a joint feedback and treatment planning session. So how would you rate the counselor's informed consent? And do you pick out any kind of potential difficulties here? Any thoughts? Dr. Little, what do you think?
I'm just reading this. They started with an initial assessment.
Huh?
That's how they started.
Yeah, first session, he started his initial assessment, just kind of got right in there.
Well, so before the initial assessment, a lot of things should have happened before that, I hope.
Like what?
Well, I mean, you have to make sure they know what they're up to, what they're going to do, what the plan is. Yeah, they have to know about confidentiality. They have to know about what your limitations are of that confidentiality. Yeah, there's exactly the cost. That's another great idea. I'll kick it back to you. I could talk for 2 months.
So no, you're right on the right track. I mean, when you're thinking about couples counseling, you think about doing initial assessment with the two of them, then you're going to do individual, then you're going to do, all that kind of stuff is textbook. I mean, but the problem is before you can do that, you need to be talking with them about what this process is going to be, how long it could potentially take. Even when you get into couple stuff, you probably needs to have some informed consent about if this doesn't go well, then, who am I going to be testifying for? Or am I going to testify for anybody? Or what are the limits of confidentiality in terms of couples work or families work? So Dr. Little, you're right on all those kinds of things that would need to be addressed before you just jump in and start working with somebody. And sometimes uninformed people just start where the patient is and just start working. Well, how can I help you solve your problem? What were you doing today? Or how are you doing today? And maybe a little bit more time needs to be spent in informed consent, kind of setting up the visit, setting up the conditions, how often we're going to meet, what the cost, length, those kind of things to be. Any other comments out there from folks? Ideas? Okay. We'll
Hey, question, Dr. Brown.
Yeah, you bet.
So, like in this case, like you said, even though, like as part of the informed consent, would it be, I know it says the initial counseling session, but once again, would it make sense to kind of identify exactly who is quote unquote kind of like the client, or whether if it's both of if
Well, I mean, that's a good question because, particularly with couples therapy, some insurances pay for it, some insurances don't pay for it. And so, if you're, and so then, you get into this kind of thing about, okay, we're going to diagnose you with depression, do you legitimately have a depressive disorder, do you have an adjustment disorder with something that we can legitimately diagnose that person with? And then we'll still with a couples, counseling, be paid for? Or is this truly a relational problem that doesn't, neither one of them are depressed, neither one of them are anxious, they can't get along, they can't communicate or whatever else. So then you really need to do informed consent on that, because, if you just kind of jump in there and decide you're going to diagnose him with a major depressive disorder so you get paid and do your couples counseling, that may really come back to cause you some problems, particularly if the marriage breaks up and he wants to subpoena the record, he wants the records brought in or something like that. He says, I never knew you called me depressed. I'm not desperate, never been depressed. I'm just married to the wrong person. So there's a lot of kind of things like that you'd want to go over and clarify, particularly in couples or family counseling before you get going. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I just wanted to make sure, like you said, that just those things, even the ground rules of whether or not you will see them individually if one or the other. Because in my mind, I was thinking, well, a lot of times if one of the spouses present for like an individual session, and it kind of, actually I just had someone talk about that earlier with me today, and it was just kind of like, well, they're going the better, the one spouse was going to counseling, and I was just trying to figure out, well, are you you're going for this, but you're having some marital problems, so you got to have to kind of decide, well, what is it? In my mind, I'm thinking, well, who's my client? Are they both?
Sean, you want to think about those kind of things. You need to think about, am I going to, if you decide not to continue marital counseling anymore, well, I see one of you and not the other. So if he decides he's through, he's out, will you see the wife or the female? Maybe not. Informed consent of marital couple, like, do I see you after we do this initial evaluation? I'll never see you individually. I only see you as a couple. All of those kind of things would certainly be informed consent kind of things. In substance abuse, it would, informed consent. Well, I see you when you're intoxicated. If you show up when you're intoxicated, what am I going to do with you? I'm going to put you in a cab. I'm going to call the police. I'm going to call a family member. If I, what's a lapse? What's a relapse? I mean, there's lots of kinds of things depending on the kind of counseling that you're doing, or the kind of therapy you're doing, the kind of patients you're working with, that, you probably need to have some informed consent about what that treatment looks like. So good question. Any other thoughts on that? All right. So let's talk about duty to warn, because that's when it comes up a lot. So a duty to warn is one of those situations when a specific threat of harm has been made. So it's got to be some kind of specific threat of harm, usually not some kind of vague kind of idea about, wish, that somebody gets sick, or wish somebody, have some kind of harm happen to them. And then it needs to be made towards a specific individual or a group. So it could be made towards a group, and it would need to be, so, if somebody said, I think I want to kill people at, 7-Elevens or something like that, that would be hard to kind of identify that. You might still want to do something about that, but that would be kind of a hard one to nail down. But if you said a specific 7-Eleven, or you said a specific person or a specific group of people at a specific time, then that takes on a whole different kind of meaning and response. So you need a specific threat at a specific individual or group that can be identified. And then you have to have a pretty good reason to believe that the person can carry out that threat. So if they say they're going to drive through, that seems to be the way people are hurting other people now a lot, is they'll drive into crowds. So if you got a vehicle and you got a car and you're able to drive, then that would be specific. If you know a person has a weapon, then that would be specific. So these are the kind of things you generally need to keep in mind when you're thinking about duty or warn. So it's a specific threat, specific individual or group that can be identified clearly, and then they have the means to carry that threat out. So what should you do? Go ahead, John.
I have a question, Doc.
Yep.
Duty to warn.
Mhm.
The scenario you presented about the mother contacting
Mhm.
the therapist or attempting to contact them. Let's go back to that.
Okay.
This is a real life situation that took place.
Mhm.
Say if the mother contacts you and you can't acknowledge anything.
Mhm.
It's that person that the client is intending to kill somebody,
Mhm.
but you can't acknowledge that that client is your patient. How do you resolve that?
So you're talking about
this-
secondhand knowledge. So the mother calls up and says, I'm calling to tell you, counselor, that my daughter's thinking about killing her boyfriend. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Well, then, you know,
And then you don't want to commit yourself because you can't say that that the person receiving services through you. And then it happens.
and then it happens.
How do you take on that one?
Well, all I can do is suggest if anybody else can chime in. We're going to talk about some, decision-making models here in a minute that might be of some help.
This is a real situation
Yeah.
that took place about 6 weeks ago.
Yeah, so I mean, off the top of my head, I mean, I think you have to think about the relationship, you have with the mother and how well do you know the mother and how much confidence or trust do you have in the mother. If you'd seen the mother or you knew the mother or you had seen the mother in kind of conjoint counseling with the daughter and you had a pretty good feel for the mother and she was pretty stable and she wouldn't be doing this unless she perceived it to be a real threat, you'd probably put some weight on that. My guess is you'd probably work with the mother to have her actually report it because she can certainly do that, or work with the mother to help the mother report that. Those would be kinds of things that I think of right off the top of my head. If it's kind of a random kind of thing and you never talk to the mother, you don't know the mother, and don't maybe even through what you've heard from the daughter, you wonder some about the mother's stability and credibility, then maybe, you don't lean quite that way. But talking about this, they have big red letters there, like you're doing now, is get consultation from your colleagues and from your legal team, if you have one. And, it's always good to get consultation from your teammates, get consultation from your colleagues, and if you have legal represent, get consultation for them. And then like that final bullet says, you need to document what you're doing, you need to document your rationale, and you need to document the consultation that you got and the actions that you're taking. Sometimes you may take the wrong action, sometimes you might take the right action. But if people can see your clinical judgment and how you went about going and making your decisions, then you're much more likely to be supported than if you just do something and say, well, that seemed to be the best thing to do at the time. That's probably not too defensible.
Dr. Brand, I have something that I can add too.
Yep. Tim?
Just another idea. What I've had, not this personally, but I've been in a one-way mirror situation where it was like a live observation and it was one of these exercises. One thing you could do if you're fielding a call from the mother, and this is just from a psychology perspective, at least from my perspective, where you could still field one-way information. You could tell that mother, like, I can't confirm or deny who that patient is. However, you could tell me as much as you want, but I can't tell you much back.
Mhm.
And if they understand that it's a one-way street of information, then you could field the information enough to suss out whether or not you should be acting or working with that mother based off of what Dr. Brand was saying, reliability, trust, relationship, rapport, all those other things. But if you come out and say, you could tell me as much as you want, but I can't confirm anything, you might be able to get enough to make a more comprehensive assessment to that threat, real or perceived, But anyway, that's just an idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes good sense. I've been in a couple of these where, somebody's getting divorced or something and somebody else calls you up and says, he said he's going to hurt somebody. It's a third hand kind of thing. And you kind of got to go through these steps and kind of weigh it out. I think in the cases that I've been involved in, I've really strongly encouraged the person who's calling me to call the authorities and that that I could help, but probably, at the time of the ones that case that I'm thinking about, I didn't feel like I was in a position to initiate the call, but certainly could, so it'd be interesting to hear what a lawyer had to say about that. So, but these are some steps you should generally take. So if it's possible, discuss it with the patient. So if the patient's making some threats about people, it might be a good idea. And I think in a case or two, I've done this, is, got a third-hand information about somebody's, getting ready to march over to somebody's house and hurt them. And I just happened to call the patient up and say, hey, what's going on? And see if there was some conversation we could have. And if they said, well, I'm fixing to go over there and light her up, then I'd tell them, well, I think I'm gonna have to call the police. I mean, I have a duty to warn. So these would be the kind of steps you would walk through, is inform the patient, of your obligation. And then when we were talking a minute ago about informed consent, that's always a good idea early on in your therapy, is talk about what the limitations of confidentiality are. And if it's a threat to others, a threat to self, then my obligation is to protect you or the other people. So then you need to notify the person who, is in potential danger, or person responsible. So it could be that, can't get hold of her, but I can get hold of her husband. And so if I know the situation of the people, I might relay that message to him. And the terrorist stuff deal, one of the problems was they didn't inform the parents. And so the parents weren't able to help the girl who was hurt. And then you'd want to notify law enforcement. And then, like we talked about a moment ago, get consultation, and you want to document your rationale. You want to document the actions taken and those kind of things. All right, here's another case. This is a challenging case, I thought. So a 35-year-old single male sought treatment to deal with his sexual concerns, primarily his lifelong history of fantasies of sex with children. His past behavior included going to parks, watching children, fantasizing about various sexual acts with them. During the course of the therapy, he talks about his 14-year-old godson, who will soon be taking with him alone on a 2-week trip, European trip. So, first question is, does a clinician have any duty to warn anybody here? That's an open-ended question. Anybody can answer.
That's,
Give an opinion.
Potentially.
Okay, Lenore, what do you think?
that's tricky.
It is.
I mean, legally, there's nothing that says you have to, but just because something is legal does not make it ethical.
There you go.
That's the dilemma, as far as I'm concerned.
I think you're onto something here. I think the dilemma is between what is maybe a legal, ethical duty, and maybe what be, some people might perceive to be a moral question in terms of, do you not, or do you not? So yes. Any other
I would
thoughts on
think
this?
that, you could possibly be brought into court, though, if you knew this person had these tendencies and then they did something to violate that child during their trip.
Mhm.
And that got into court and you knew that he had those tendencies and you did nothing. I would think that that could cause you some problems, I would think.
Yes, I don't think this is me looking at this and thinking, I don't think you have an obligation. So the jokes here, we'll talk about this in a minute. I mean, the problem is, you don't have an obligation to protect the 14-year-old, legal obligation, ethical obligation, because he's not your patient, so you don't have an obligation. On the other hand, you have a confidentiality obligation to the patient.
But legally, whenever you talk about your limits of confidentiality with your patients, you have this duty to report any. Well, okay, so that makes it tricky still.
Yeah,
You
it
have
does,
this-
doesn't it?
because I think at this point, like, I mean, just having those thoughts and having that tendency of what he's discussed doesn't mean he's necessarily going to act on it. I mean, it feels
Right.
just kind of like, well, it's neither here nor there at that point. But when the Good Samaritan, I mean, it may definitely, well, I'm thinking about this could fracture that client provider relationship.
Yes, I think it could if the provider decided he just had or she had to, call the son, great godson up and tell his parent. I mean, I think that would be a violation of, unless he gave permission. I'm not sure you would be standing on any solid ground ethically to do that.
But also, I mean, yeah, that is tricky because I'm thinking if you called to report it in, I mean, I've made a few calls to DHS before and essentially have just kind of been told, well, this not covered. I would think the authorities would just about say, well, there wouldn't be any reason to take action.
Right?
I mean,
Alexander,
by
what
the
were you gonna
authorities.
say? You had your hand up, Alexander?
Well, I was initially, I would want to explore, because before it was just, he was thinking about it, and now it seems like he's making some preparations for that. But could we remind him of our duty to warn, or no? I mean,
I don't know that, I mean, I'm not, I think you might, as a clinician, you might have real hard talks with him about what his plans are on his 2-week vacation and talk about a real test for your therapeutic skill in terms of helping the guy, because he's coming to you because he's having these, as I understand it, coming to you because he's having these fantasies and he wants to stop it. So it's a real test for your therapy. But, you might have to talk about separate rooms. You might have to talk about any of those kind of things. I don't know why your heartstrings kind of pull you to do something. I don't know exactly on what basis you do that. Well, what do you got? Yeah, go ahead.
So what kind of stands out here to me is the fact that his behaviors are his past behaviors, and it doesn't say that those are his current behaviors.
Mhm.
And that he's actually engaging in them now. And number one. Number two is that he is seeking treatment. But if you look at it in the context of someone who you would be concerned about, maybe if they were considering suicide, when you evaluate them for suicidal ideations, you evaluate that based upon what their current thoughts are, not necessarily their past thoughts. And we take action based upon their current thoughts versus their past thoughts. And I think this is very similar.
It could be. This one was a real dilemma. We're gonna run out of time though. We're gonna have to move on, but hopefully we won't face one like that. So in terms of malpractice, I'm gonna go over this quickly because we are gonna run out of time. So what has to happen in a malpractice? Because the defendant so that's the counselor, generally speaking, had to have a legal duty to the plaintiff, which would be the patient or the client. And then the defendant, that's the counselor, somehow violated that. And that would be something he or she knew to do that didn't, and that would be a commission. Or the defendant refrained or, from doing something, refrained from executing something that they should have done, and that's an omission, and both are breaches of duty. So, something that, a commission, when you have sex with a patient, that's a commission because everybody knows you're not supposed to do that. And you did something, you're supposed to not do that and you did it. And so it's hard to show that, there wasn't a breach of duty to protect that person's safety and those kind of things. An omission is probably when you should have asked somebody if they were suicidal, asked somebody about something and you didn't because you didn't want to embarrass them. You didn't have time. You forgot about those kind of things. So the point is that the breach of duty can be the commission or it can be omission. And then there has to be some kind of injury. And so in cases like, sexual misconduct with the patient, it's always hard to show that there wasn't mental injury to the patient, because there's always some kind of trust problem. There's always some kind of loyalty problem. There's always some kind of, you violated my rights, you violated me personally. So it's really hard to prove that, there wasn't an injury in those cases, but an injury has to be proved. And then there has to be some kind of foreseeable, connection between the breach of duty, the injury, and, what the clinician did. So those three things have to be there. So, you owed him something, you didn't provide it, there was an injury, and then, there's proximal cause. That's what they would call that. And in a civil case, it just has to be the preponderance of evidence. So if you look at it, it's, 50, 60. And so, we're going to go with 60. It doesn't have to be beyond a reasonable doubt. It just has to be that the evidence pretty much suggests that. So when you're thinking about malpractice, thinking about saying malpractice, make sure that, you know, you perform your duties, no commissions or omissions, and that, you know, you make sure that the patient is not injured in some way, when that could be personal property, financial, any number of ways, and there's not a foreseeable connection. All right. So here, this might have been helpful in that other case we were talking about. So these are values clarifications. So one thing is, you know, is an action threaten someone's life, physical well-being, or chances of survival? So obviously that's pretty high on the list. We wouldn't want to do anything that's going to physically threaten, as mental health counselors, we don't do anything that was going to threaten somebody's physical well-being. And there, you know, years ago, there were cases where people did holding things and they wrapped the kids up in blankets and did that kind of stuff. And, you know, actually they suffocated. And so that would be putting somebody's life at risk. So it didn't go well for those providers, but so you don't want to do that. Secondly, you don't want to treat somebody in a fundamentally unjust way. You know, probably here we're talking sometimes about abandonment and those kind of things. I shut my practice down. I decided not to see you, so I just stopped. Then you don't want to, you know, limit someone's self-determination autonomy. Just put them in the hospital for the sake of putting them in the hospital, or put them in a restricted level of care that's really not necessary. Do something that's going to injure somebody financially. Billing, those kind of things, you have to be careful about those. You don't want to risk somebody's neighborhood or community as a whole. Right to privacy is always a concern. And then you want to be truthful with people or with the community if you're doing community practice kinds of things. So here's an integrated model of ethical behavior, and we'll go through this pretty quickly. So you want to interpret the situations, you know, find out the facts, and then you want to formulate, you know, an ethical decision. So you look at the laws, you look at the codes, you look at the principles that may have been broken, and you formulate some kind of ethical decision. You want to select a course of action, kind of weighing competing actions in terms of what might or might not occur, and then you plan and execute your actions. This is kind of what we talked about with some of the with the case of the mother calling. So here's a case. So what do you think about this one? So you're working as an employee in a group practice. You recently accidentally came across some business documents. On closer inspection, you learn that the clinic manager has been rounding your CPT 90834s up to 90837s. You also come to find out that the family practice clinic that owns your building is only charging your practice $1 a year for rent. Are there any problems here? Anybody got an idea? Well, for the sake of time, there's two problems that I see. One is upcoding, which will get you in real trouble. And then two is, you know, you're probably not getting your building at fair market value, which would be a problem. Now then, you know, if chances are you're seeing Medicare, Medicaid patients, those kind of things definitely a problem. Now then, you know, as an ethical kind of consideration, you might say, well, I accidentally came across these papers, and so I'm really not in the decision making. I'm just a member of the group, and so I really don't need to do anything because I'm not responsible. So if you look into the Medicare, Medicaid laws, you'll see if you knowingly withhold information that's a violation or fraud or misconduct, then you're guilty. You're guilty too. So you're in a real dilemma here because now you have information that you need to report, and it's reporting on yourself in some ways. So, okay. So ethical dilemmas, here's another little bit about how to manage ethical dilemmas. Review the ethical codes and laws. You're going to consider how the statutes may apply in this particular situation. And then you can reach out and see how other professionals would handle it. You might ask nursing, you might ask psychology, and you kind of do your analysis based on that. Ethical dilemmas, this is an integrated model. It's pretty straightforward. So you take a look at things at the provider or client level, and you kind of analyze them there. Then you kind of look at it from a multidisciplinary standpoint. So what psychologists do, what would marriage and family therapy do? And if you're a substance abuse counselor, LADC, you're seeing couples, it might be good to look at what the marriage and family therapy guys have to say about some of that kind of stuff, because that's a little bit more in the middle of wheelhouse. Institutionally, where are things? So then again, you're looking at Medicare, Medicaid, Joint Commission, CARF, and all that. And then you're looking at what's good at the public level. I kind of like this one. This one comes out of this is restorative justice, and so this comes out of kind of the compliance world. And rather than trying to get somebody, it's really to take a look at what actions need to be done. So you have these two kind of columns, and one's impact assessment, one's explanation. So in the impact, the first step you do is you try to figure out what happened. Were errors made? Were they honest errors? Were they accidental errors? What was the incident? And really what you're trying to determine was, is this malicious and was it malicious? Was it intentional or unintentional? And what was going on? Somebody make an honest mistake in a situation, it's not malicious. But then when, if you set a patient up to take their money or to sexually exploit him, that's pretty much malicious and intentional. And then number two is you want an assessment. So what was the nature of the events? Here you're not looking at, document what happened, what, when, where, who, what was the timeline, how did this come about? And the thing I like about this one is it's restorative. So, what happened, who was affected, and what do you do to make things right given an ethical or legal problem? So you document the details of the event with fairness. And then step 4 is who is affected. So, in the case of the 14-year-old boy and the patient who was interested in children, I mean, who's the victim, who's the secondary victim? The mother calling, who's the victim, who's the secondary victim, those kind of things. So you identify the individuals who've been negatively affected or harmed. And so you take a look at that and you try to understand both or all the positions. And then you formulate an action, and the action could be, recommendations, a conversation, discussion. You got a process problem here, maybe with the situation with the billing and so forth. Maybe this person needs some education or some coaching or referral to get some help. And so you identify these action steps. And the last thing is, a timetable for improvement, how you want to see things happen. And you have a performance improvement kind of feedback loop to ensure that kind of ethical problems don't occur again. So I kind of like this. It's a little bit more involved, but it's kind of a little more practical for me. So here's a case. So in an initial session for substance abuse treatment, a 25-year-old woman admits that she's stolen $10,000 from her employer. She breaks down emotionally and says it's because she hates the people she works with. They are mean to her. She further states that it's because her father sexually abused her from the time she was 16. She begs the counselor not to tell the police or her employer. In an effort to comfort her, the counselor puts his arm around her and he tells her he won't tell anybody and everything will be okay. Any thoughts on that one?
Keep your hands to yourself.
Good idea. Good idea. Anybody else? So if you were going to go back, if we were going to go back here, I mean, so what kinds of things, actions, who's a victim? I don't know if the clinician's the victim or the patient's the victim. It's hard for me to tell on that one. But, if you're going to walk through this, so is this intentional or unintentional? Was it malicious on his part, the counselor's part? I'm guessing not, but I don't know that.
I wouldn't think so, because
All right. And so what was the nature of the event? She's distressed, she's upset, it's the first visit. Maybe, he's trying to, so in restore, what happened, who was affected, those kind of things. And like I said, I don't know who's the victim, but then, you're talking about this guy, you're running the clinic, you find out about this. So what kind of things might you want to do for the counselor to avoid, a situation where this comes up again?
you're treating this person, you're their clinician.
I'm not, but somebody is.
I mean, yeah, that's the situation. This is a clinician talking to a patient, and the patient is the one who stole the money.
No, the patient stole the money.
Not from the same company that you work for.
No. They stole it
Her
from their
employee.
employer. You just happen to be the
you're
counseling
not playing
center.
police
She comes
officer.
in. Huh?
You don't have permission to disclose all that information to anybody. She told you that in confidence as a patient.
That's a good point, because unless there's somebody's, life or limb, at stake here, you have a duty to warn. She tells you that in confidence. Although, you might check your state statutes, because some state statutes say that if, a crime has been committed, you're obligated. So you're in that bind between, do you disclose because you have a state statute that says I'm supposed to disclose when I know that a crime has occurred, or do you have privilege and you want to withhold that? So that's a good question. And depending on, after you look up the state laws and you figure that out, it'd be good to get consultation and document that. So I don't think that's, to me, I don't think that's the major ethical problem here.
I guess I feel.
Anybody else got a thought?
The ethical problem is keeping your hands off from around somebody so that you
Totally
don't
agree.
so that you don't encourage them.
Right. And there,
So that-
yeah,
so that you don't affirm
Right.
what they did is okay.
Right?
and this
that
is the initial, we don't know if she really broke a law. That's not the focus. I'm with the last person who spoke. I think the thing is for the counselor is, the arm around and
Mhm.
telling that he won't tell anyone, because at a point he may have to tell somebody about something. So
mean,
making those promises.
Right. I mean, Rita, that's a good point. As mental health guys, we tend to believe everything our patients tell us, generally speaking. I mean, she may or may not have stolen $10,000.
Well,
Right.
another thing you have to keep in mind, if you put your arm around somebody, you may be giving them affirmation, and then they may go out and steal $10,000.
Could be, could be. So
Well,
here, I think this
yeah.
is, right, go ahead.
Well, I'm stuck on the arm around. At some point, you have to keep some distance, and this is the first. And people usually come to us and they're that emotional, especially if they have been sexually abused. It triggers things that we may not be ready to deal with, especially that early on. And
Right, I think the ethical concern is his behavior and cross the, if not a, it's at least a boundary crossing, if not a boundary violation, for certain.
you said that so well.
And we have a good and we have a good alibi to not cross those boundaries because of COVID. Keep your distance.
Yeah, so,
Well, when you're dealing with sexually abused people, male, female, or whatever, signals get mixed up so
Oh, yeah.
easily.
oh, yeah.
So easily, and we as counselors need to
Yep.
be very aware.
You're right, Rita.
Just a thought.
So any other questions, comments before we wrap up? Because we're right at 3:00.
I like this.
This
Oh,
was
good. I'm
good.
glad it was
I like
helpful.
the format. I really do, and I learned some stuff, and I'm gonna be quiet.
Okay, well, good. All right, well, I'll look for y'all next week, and have a good weekend. Be safe.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye-bye.